Your final project this semester is going to be based on Alla Prima painting and impasto painting. Alla Prima, also known as wet on wet, is Italian for at first attempt. It's a type of painting technique in which layers of wet paint are applied to previously administered layers of wet paint. This requires a fast way of working. It can also be referred to as direct painting. The painting on the right that you'll see is a very famous Impressionist painting um, done by Monet, known as An Impression at Sunset. Now, we look at this today and it looks like a beautiful work of art. But at the time, it was a controversial painting. The Impressionists were working in a style that hadn't been seen before. Traditionally, artists use the techniques that we've used this semester that are very labor intensive, where you paint intricate underpaintings and you glaze different layers over top. That was seen as traditional academic painting. Now, the Impressionists weren't interested in super fine, detailed paintings. They were interested in capturing what you might see in a moment. And Monet actually painted this in a boat at sunset. So he was attempting to capture that feeling of the light bouncing off of the water and did so very successfully. And we see this in a lot of Monet's pieces on the water, catching those reflections in the light, really interested in using all those complementary colors in the shadows. As you can see here, we see that happening in between the leaves. He's using blue and orange complementary colors up against each other, and he also uses them in the shadows. And the unique thing that happened too at this point, previously in the history of painting, when you wanted to make a painting, you had to do everything from scratch. You had to grind up your pigments, add oil to it, something that was really required to do inside of a studio. Around this time period, they started making paint in tubes that you could go pick up from a store. So you could actually take those tubes of paint, like we mentioned, anywhere that you wanted, into a boat, outside, and it freed up the way in which artists could paint. They could look at things in the moment. And artists not only did that with landscape, but they also did it with people, right? This is a piece by Renoir, captured in the moment in a cafe. And if you notice, it feels like a very detailed painting, but it's not detailed in the same way we were focused on our portraits. Every now and then you might catch a detail of a person's face, but it's not super detailed. We're not seeing every little eyelash and nostril and detail of the ear. We're catching them in that moment, right? If you look at all the different the front figures here, it almost looks as if they're little holes in their clothes, right? Or strange speckling of light. Renoir wasn't interested in capturing the detail of those people's clothes. He was interested in capturing the way the light was trickling down through the trees onto this cafe scene. So less actually interested in capturing the detail of their clothes, more interested in the ambient light. Now we're going to look at Monet again. He's one of the most famous Impressionist painters, but he was also known for going back to the same scene over and over again and looking at those details of the light. Water lilies is one of his famous examples. But haystacks he was known to paint a lot of. And haystacks, you probably, in reality, if you were trying to pick a super boring subject matter, you probably couldn't choose a more boring sounding one than a haystack, right? But he actually made these into interesting, beautiful paintings because he wasn't interested in the haystack itself, but the light surrounding the haystack. And this kind of takes us to our project that you're going to start working on today. He thought about the way the light reflected off of these paintings, and he would actually start each one of his paintings with a different colored ground background. So he would prepare his canvas in the studio, knowing what time of day he might go out or what time of year, and then use that sort of as a ground that he could quickly paint on and use reflected light on. So if you're imagining what those backgrounds might be, you can think, I don't know if you can tell this one, he started with yellow, so we're leaving some yellow in the background and letting it peep through in spots here and there where he desired it. Can you imagine what this one might be? Red, right? He could start with a red background, cover the background with blue, use little blips here and there. You can see some of the red even peeping in back in that background, back where you see those blue faded out hills. This one, pink, that he's also used a blue paint over top of. So you can think, you can, as you've already painted your backgrounds, you're going to have a starting point, and you're not going to have that be the whole of your piece. You're going to let that background color seep through here and there. There are contemporary artists who also use the idea of impasto painting. And when we think about impasto, like we said, we're not looking at those little fine details, but we're letting the brush strokes exist as they are. So not getting all fussy, but almost allowing the strokes to help mold and replicate the piece. We're not taking that flat brush and smoothing everything back out. And it gives it a very textural look, right? As you can see in this piece by Jenny Saville. Dana Schultz is also known for her impasto pieces, sculpting the figure and their forms, letting some of those weird shapes exist as they are. John Socini also is known for his very beautifully sculpted impasto paintings, letting things like the brushstrokes become those wrinkles in the pants, the folds of the clothes, looking for those larger shapes and focusing less on those little tiny details. I always put this up kind of as a joke, kind of as an homage. Probably the most well-known Alla Prima painter, as you can imagine. And this is a meme, sort of, to reference if you've ever watched the show, The Happy Little Trees. I painted this entire picture in 3 strokes using the color orange. Well, as you know, that's impossible. Part of Alla Prima painting is that you're trying to create shapes with the fewest amount of brush strokes possible, and you're just letting those strokes exist. So you can think about that as you're working, sort of trying to just let things be and see if it works. Impasto is another word to describe those thick brushstrokes, so meaning Italian for paste, painting with thick, visible texture and brushstrokes. Now, normally when we were in class, I have some things for you to actually add to your paints, like if you wanted to add and create some texture. There are certain mediums that you can buy for oil and acrylic paint to make your paint more thick and paste-like. If you are at home, one of the simplest things that you can add to your paint is sand. You can take a little bit of sand and mix it with your paint to give it kind of a thicker, grainy texture for either oil or acrylic paint. You could also add salt. That's another kind of common thing to give it sort of a grainy look. And artists will often do things like this. They will add something, as long as it's not organic and biodegradable, to their paint, so to give it a kind of a thicker texture. Anselm Kiefer is an artist who does this for conceptual reasons. He's a German artist who grew up after World War II. A lot of his work is about growing up in the aftermath of World War II and the trauma that it caused the nation and the people and everyone who died during that war. Um, he paints landscapes that sort of talk about that trauma. This is a piece that is called Lot's Wife. If you've ever heard the story of Lot, uh, Lot's wife, that she was told not to look back, uh, and if not, she would be turned into a pillar of salt. So that idea that you're as Germans, oftentimes they were told not to look back and think about the past, but what happens if you don't do that, right? History repeats itself. And to make this piece, Anselm Kiefer actually used salt. He mixed some of his paint with salt, and he actually has used pieces of torn up railroad ties that were taken from railroads that were used to take victims to concentration camps. So you can imagine there's sort of a lot of powerful meaning to the materials he chose to mix with his paints when making this piece. Okay, so tools that you need to use for your impasto painting. You will be using your palette knife to actually physically apply some of the paint to your piece. Um, Boar hair brushes, if you have them, or those thicker brushes. Uh, you can just use your regular brushes as well that you have for this piece. Sometimes people like to use those thicker brushes to apply the paint when they're painting in impasto because they hold a little bit more than the synthetic brushes. Plastic utensils like knives, forks, or spoons you can use to come back and scratch through to your colored ground. Rags, paint scrapers. Like I mentioned, you can mix sand with your paint, rocks, beads, plastic particles, anything that's small enough to hold within the paint, you can add to your paint to add texture. As I mentioned before, you can also add different mediums to your paint to give it a texture. Unfortunately, when we are in class, I have all these mediums available for you to try while you're working, but because we are at home right now, I will just kind of show these in case you're ever interested in trying them in the future. Acrylic paints, they have a big variety of mediums that you can add to your paint. The one that adds the most thickness to the paint is modeling paste. It gives it sort of a toothpastey, very thick feel. So if you apply it, it will give you really stiff peaks and ridges. Gel medium is sort of a step down from that. It's sort of a more soupy like consistency, but it allows you to paint with very sort of thick visible strokes. Pumice gel medium actually looks very similar to what you would get when you add sand to your paint. It's very kind of textured, rough feel. Texture gel medium is a little bit thicker, like thicker chunks of sand that you would add into your paint. Obviously, we've used gloss or matte medium. And you can also use retarder while you're working to help slow down the dry time a little bit and give you a longer chance to work wet on wet. Oil, wax medium is the one that is going to give you the most thick, sort of pasty like feel to the oil paints. With wax medium, if you have a lot of wax in there, sometimes you have to add a dryer to get it to dry essentially, because otherwise it stays wet for seemingly forever. So usually when you use the wax medium, you add a little bit of your Galclid or Liquin, which are dryers, to help the wax dry. Um, and Liquin, as I mentioned, is a dryer. Sometimes people will use it when they're working wet on wet so that it dries faster and becomes tackier and you can work with it. If you bought the kit, you have Galclid. Same thing, you add a little bit to your paint to let it dry, get tackier a little bit quicker. That way, if you want to go in and um, add a little bit more over top, it's going to dry within like a half day, a day, and give you a little bit more opportunity to work into it. And any of the Alclid mediums, this Galclid makes these different mediums, and they have ones that'll kind of mimic some of the pumice and texture gel mediums. So you guys should have already prepared for gesso supports. Remember, they only have to be like 12 by 12 or smaller. We're going to do 4 of these, but the idea is that each one you're only really working on for about 2.5 hours tops. They're not meant to be super long paintings. Everyone doesn't have to be a perfect, beautiful finished painting. If we were doing this in class, we would work on one a day for 4 class periods, just trying out different things and doing the Alla Prima techniques. So they're meant to be kind of short little experiments. So don't feel like these all have to be perfect finished paintings. You could be unhappy with some of them and you will still have a great project, right? It's just trying something new and doing them in little short, quick bursts. So, you should have, like I said, 2 that are warm color, red, orange, or yellow, or 2 that are cool color, blue, green, or purple. I'm going to leave the subject matter for your Alma pieces very open-ended, other than organic shapes, so kind of more natural shapes. Think about things, you know, that are going to be easy to complete within that idea that you're going to try to have this painting complete within a 2.5 hour period. So the whole painting should be done within that time period. So what you're trying to do is pick something that's interesting, but that's not so crazy that you can't get it done. Think about avoiding things with too complex of details that would be difficult to simplify. Remember, we're trying to recreate textures with 1 or 2 kind of simple strokes. Organic shapes and forms. Remember, think about freeform shapes that are unpredictable, flowing in appearance. Natural world, plants, sky. I have had people do things that are more geometric shapes and have them come out very successfully. Just realize that if you're going to do that, don't expect perfect hard edges, right? These are going to be kind of looser, rougher little paintings. All right, have fun with these.